The icy wind howled through the empty streets, carrying with it the faint sound of Christmas carols from a distant church. Snowflakes fell gently, covering the city in a blanket of white. It was Christmas Eve, and most people were indoors, gathered around warm fires and twinkling trees. But not everyone was so fortunate. On a dimly lit street corner, a little girl sat huddled under a torn blanket. Her small hands trembled as she held out a rusty tin cup, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, sir, ma'am, can you spare some change? I'm so hungry." Her face was pale, her clothes threadbare, and her eyes filled with a sadness far beyond her years. Just a few feet away, a man in a sleek black coat walked briskly past her. His polished shoes clicked against the pavement, and the gold watch on his wrist glinted under the streetlight. He was a millionaire, known across the city for his wealth and success. But tonight, his mind was elsewhere, lost in thoughts of business deals and board meetings. The girl's voice reached him, soft and pleading. "Please, sir, it's Christmas." For a moment, he paused. His eyes flicked toward her, but only for a second. He tightened his coat around him and muttered under his breath, "Someone else will help her." Without another glance, he walked away, his footsteps fading into the night. The girl's shoulders slumped, and she pulled the blanket tighter around her. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she wiped them away quickly. She had learned not to cry. Unseen by anyone, an old man stood in the shadows, watching the scene unfold. His face was weathered, his eyes sharp and knowing. He shook his head slowly and whispered, "Fate has its own way of teaching lessons." The millionaire arrived at his mansion, a towering structure of glass and steel. Inside, the air was warm, and the scent of pine filled the grand hallway. A massive Christmas tree stood in the corner, adorned with glittering ornaments and twinkling lights. But the man barely noticed. He tossed his coat onto a chair and poured himself a drink, sinking into the plush sofa. As he sipped his whiskey, a strange feeling crept over him. The room seemed colder, the lights dimmer. He shook it off, blaming it on the long day. But then, he heard it, a faint, echoing voice. "Please, sir, it's Christmas." He froze, the glass slipping from his hand and shattering on the floor. The voice was unmistakable. It was the beggar girl's voice. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice trembling. No one answered. But as he turned, he saw a faint glow coming from the hallway. It was soft and golden, like the light of a candle. Against his better judgment, he followed it. The glow led him to a room he rarely used, a small study filled with dusty books and old photographs. In the center of the room stood the beggar girl. But she was no longer the frail, shivering child he had seen on the street. Her face was radiant, her eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. She smiled at him, but there was no warmth in it, only a quiet, unsettling power. "You ignored me," she said, her voice echoing as if it came from everywhere and nowhere at once. "But I am not here to punish you. I am here to teach you." The millionaire stumbled back, his heart pounding. What are you?" The girl tilted her head, her smile fading. "I am a reflection of your choices. And tonight, you will see what those choices have cost you." Before he could respond, the room began to spin. The walls dissolved into darkness, and the millionaire felt himself falling into a void he couldn't understand. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer in his mansion. He was standing on the same street corner where he had seen the girl. But something was different. The city was silent, the streets empty. The snow had stopped falling, and the air was thick with an eerie stillness. And then, he saw her again, the beggar girl. She was sitting in the same spot, her tin cup in hand. But this time, she looked directly at him, her eyes piercing into his soul. "Your journey begins now," she said. "And it will not end until you learn the truth." The millionaire wanted to run, to scream, to wake up from this nightmare. But he couldn't move. He was trapped, caught in a web of his own making. And as the girl's words echoed in his mind, he realized one thing: this was only the beginning. The millionaire stood frozen on the empty street, his breath visible in the cold air. The beggar girl's words echoed in his mind, sending a shiver down his spine that had nothing to do with the winter chill. He blinked, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was this a dream? A hallucination? He pinched himself, but the pain felt real. The girl was still there, sitting on the curb, her tin cup resting in her lap. She looked at him with those glowing eyes, her expression calm but unnerving. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" The girl smiled faintly. "I already told you. I am here to teach you. But first, you must understand what you've done." Before he could respond, the scene around him began to shift. The street melted away, replaced by a bustling city square. People hurried past, their faces blurred, their voices a distant hum. The millionaire recognized this place. It was the heart of the city, where he had built his empire. But something was different. The people around him were struggling. A man in a tattered coat sat on the steps of a building, holding a sign that read, "Lost my job. Please help." A woman nearby was rummaging through a trash can, pulling out scraps of food. Children played in the alley, their clothes dirty and torn. The millionaire frowned. "What is this? Why are you showing me this?" The girl appeared beside him, her presence calm but commanding. "This is the world you've created," she said. "Every decision you've made, every life you've ignored, it has led to this." He shook his head. "No. This isn't my fault. I've worked hard for everything I have. I've earned my success." The girl's gaze hardened. "Success at what cost? Look around you. These people are suffering because of choices made by people like you. You could have helped them. You could have made a difference. But you chose to turn away." The millionaire opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. Deep down, he knew she was right. He had always put his own interests first, dismissing the struggles of others as someone else's problem. The scene shifted again, and this time, he was standing outside a small house. Through the window, he could see a family gathered around a table. They were laughing, sharing a simple meal. It was a stark contrast to the poverty he had just witnessed. "That family," the girl said, pointing to the house. "They were once on the brink of losing everything. But someone showed them kindness. Someone gave them a chance. And now, they're thriving." The millionaire felt a pang of guilt. He had never taken the time to help anyone like that. He had always been too busy, too focused on his own goals. The girl turned to him, her eyes softening. "It's not too late to change. But you must be willing to see the truth." Before he could respond, the world around him dissolved once more. He found himself back in his mansion, standing in the grand hallway. Everything looked the same, but something felt off. The lights flickered, and the air grew colder. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see the beggar girl walking toward him. She was no longer glowing, but her presence was just as powerful. "You have 24 hours, she said. 24 hours to prove that you can change. If you fail, you will lose everything." The millionaire's heart raced. "What do you mean? What am I supposed to do?" The girl smiled faintly. "That's for you to figure out. But remember, every choice you make will have consequences. Choose wisely." With that, she vanished, leaving him alone in the silent mansion. The millionaire sank into a chair, his mind racing. He didn't know where to start or what to do. But one thing was clear: he couldn't ignore this. He had to try. As he sat there, a strange feeling washed over him. For the first time in years, he felt something other than ambition or greed. He felt hope. But it was a fragile hope, one that could easily be shattered. The clock was ticking. The mansion was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made the millionaire's skin crawl. He sat in the grand hallway, his mind racing as he tried to process what had just happened. The beggar girl's words echoed in his ears, "You have 24 hours. Choose wisely." He glanced at the ornate clock on the wall. The hands ticked steadily, a reminder that time was slipping away. He didn't know where to start, but he knew he couldn't sit still. As he stood up, the air around him seemed to shift. The walls of the mansion blurred, and the floor beneath his feet dissolved. He felt a strange pulling sensation, as if he were being drawn into another world. When the dizziness subsided, he found himself standing in a familiar place, a small, run-down neighborhood he hadn't seen in decades. The houses were modest, the streets lined with cracked pavement. It was the neighborhood where he had grown up. A wave of nostalgia washed over him, but it was quickly replaced by unease. Why was he here? The sound of laughter caught his attention. He turned and saw a young boy running down the street, a tattered backpack slung over his shoulder. The boy's face was flushed with excitement, his eyes bright with dreams. The millionaire's breath hitched. The boy was him, his younger self. He watched as the boy stopped in front of a small house and bounded up the steps. Through the window, the millionaire could see a woman in the kitchen, her hands busy kneading dough. It was his mother. Memories flooded back, memories he had buried long ago. His mother had worked tirelessly to provide for him, often going without so he could have what he needed. She had believed in him, encouraged him to dream big. The scene shifted, and he was inside the house. His younger self sat at the kitchen table, scribbling in a notebook. "One day, I'm going to be rich," the boy said, his voice full of determination. "I'm going to have a big house and a fancy car. And I'll never have to worry about money again." His mother smiled, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "Money isn't everything, my dear. What matters most is the kind of person you become." The boy nodded, but it was clear he didn't fully understand. The millionaire felt a lump in his throat. He had forgotten those words, forgotten the lessons his mother had tried to teach him. The scene changed again, and he was standing outside a school. His younger self was older now, a teenager with a chip on his shoulder. He watched as the boy ignored a classmate who was being bullied, too focused on his own ambitions to care. The millionaire's chest tightened. He remembered that day. He had told himself it wasn't his problem, that he had more important things to worry about. But now, seeing it from the outside, he felt a deep sense of shame. The scenes continued to flash before his eyes, moments from his past where he had chosen selfishness over kindness, ambition over compassion. He saw the friends he had pushed away, the opportunities he had missed to make a difference. The final scene was the hardest to watch. He was in his early 20s, standing in a hospital room. His mother lay in the bed, frail and weak. "I'm proud of you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But remember, true success isn't measured by wealth. It's measured by the lives you touch." Tears streamed down the millionaire's face as he watched his younger self nod, too caught up in his own grief to truly understand the weight of her words. The scene faded, and he was back in the mansion, alone once more. The beggar girl's voice echoed in his mind. "Now you see the truth. The choices you made, the lives you ignored, they shaped the world around you." The millionaire sank to his knees, overwhelmed by guilt and regret. He had spent so much of his life chasing success, but at what cost? He had lost sight of what truly mattered. But the girl's words also gave him hope. It's not too late to change. He didn't know how, but he was determined to try. The millionaire sat on the cold marble floor of his mansion, his mind reeling from the flood of memories. The beggar girl's words echoed in his ears, "It's not too late to change." But how? Where could he even begin? As he struggled to gather his thoughts, the air around him grew heavy, and the room began to blur. He felt that familiar pulling sensation again, and before he could react, he was no longer in the mansion. When his vision cleared, he found himself standing in the middle of a bustling city street. But this wasn't the city he knew. The buildings were crumbling, the streets littered with trash. People shuffled past, their faces gaunt and their eyes hollow. The air smelled of decay and despair. The millionaire looked down at himself and gasped. His expensive suit was gone, replaced by tattered, dirty clothes. His hands were rough and calloused, and his feet were bare against the cold pavement. What is this?" he muttered, his voice trembling. A voice behind him made him turn. "This is your test." It was the beggar girl. She stood a few feet away, her glowing eyes piercing through the gloom. "You wanted to understand," she said. "Now you will." Before he could respond, she vanished, leaving him alone in this grim, unfamiliar world. The millionaire, no, the beggar, looked around, his heart pounding. He had no money, no food, no shelter. For the first time in his life, he was completely vulnerable. As he wandered the streets, he noticed the people around him. A man sat on the sidewalk, holding a sign that read, "Hungry. Please help." A woman nearby was rummaging through a trash can, pulling out scraps of food. Children huddled together in an alley, their faces smudged with dirt. The millionaire's stomach growled, a sharp reminder of his own hunger. He approached a food cart, where a vendor was handing out steaming bowls of soup. "Please," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Can I have some food?" The vendor glanced at him and shook his head. "No money, no food. Move along." The millionaire's heart sank. He had never been on this side of the equation before. He had always been the one with the power, the one who could choose whether to help or ignore. Now, he was the one being ignored. He stumbled away, his legs weak and his head spinning. As he walked, he noticed a small crowd gathered around a man handing out bread. Desperate, he joined the line, hoping to get a piece. But when it was his turn, the man looked him up and down and said, "Sorry, we're out." The millionaire felt a surge of anger and frustration. "Please," he begged. "I haven't eaten in days." The man shrugged. "Not my problem." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had said those same words so many times in his life, dismissing the struggles of others without a second thought. Now, he was the one being dismissed. As the day wore on, the millionaire grew weaker. His feet ached from walking, and his throat was parched. He tried to beg for money, but most people ignored him. A few tossed coins his way, but it wasn't enough to buy even a piece of bread. Just as he was about to give up, he noticed a small boy sitting on the steps of a building. The boy was thin and pale, his clothes hanging loosely on his frame. In his hands, he held a single piece of bread. The millionaire's stomach growled again, and he approached the boy. "Please," he said. "Can you spare some bread?" The boy looked up at him, his eyes wide and innocent. For a moment, the millionaire thought he would refuse. But then, the boy broke the bread in half and held out a piece. "Here," he said softly. "You look hungry." The millionaire stared at the bread, his hands trembling. He wanted to take it, to devour it in one bite. But something stopped him. "Why are you giving this to me?" he asked. The boy shrugged. "Because you need it more than I do." Tears welled up in the millionaire's eyes as he took the bread. It was the smallest act of kindness, but it meant more to him than anything he had ever received. As he ate, he felt a warmth spread through him, not just from the food, but from the boy's selflessness. For the first time, he understood the power of compassion. The scene around him began to fade, and he found himself back in the mansion. The beggar girl stood before him, her expression unreadable. "Do you understand now?" she asked. The millionaire nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I do. I understand." The girl smiled faintly. "Then your journey is not over. There is still more to learn." The millionaire stood in the grand hallway of his mansion, the taste of the boy's bread still lingering in his mouth. His heart felt heavy, yet strangely lighter at the same time. The beggar girl's words echoed in his mind, "There is still more to learn." Before he could ask what she meant, the air around him shifted once more. The walls of the mansion dissolved, and he found himself standing in a vast, endless space. It was neither light nor dark, but a swirling gray void that seemed to stretch on forever. In front of him, a single thread of light appeared, glowing faintly. As he watched, the thread began to multiply, branching out into countless strands that formed an intricate web. Each thread pulsed with a soft, golden light, and he realized they were connected, each one touching and influencing the others. The beggar girl appeared beside him, her presence calm and steady. "This is the ripple effect," she said, gesturing to the web. "Every choice you make, every action you take, sends ripples through the world. Some are small, barely noticeable. Others are large, changing the course of lives." The millionaire's chest tightened as he realized the man was on the verge of losing his home. The scene shifted, and he was in a hospital room. A woman lay in the bed, her face pale and drawn. Beside her sat a young girl, clutching her mother's hand. The millionaire recognized the woman too. She had been a cleaner in his office building. He remembered ignoring her when she had asked for a raise, telling her he couldn't afford it. Now, she was sick, and her daughter was struggling to take care of her. The scenes continued to flash before his eyes, moments from his past where his choices had caused pain and suffering. He saw the families he had evicted to make way for his developments, the small businesses he had driven into the ground, the people he had dismissed without a second thought. Each scene was like a punch to the gut, a reminder of the lives he had damaged. But then, something changed. The threads of light began to shift, showing him a different set of scenes. He saw the boy who had shared his bread, smiling as he played with other children. He saw the families he had evicted to make way for his developments, the small businesses he had driven into the ground, the people he had dismissed without a second thought. Each scene was like a punch to the gut, a reminder of the lives he had damaged. But then, something changed. The threads of light began to shift, showing him a different set of scenes. He saw the boy who had shared his bread, smiling as he played with other children. He saw the man who had handed out bread, his small act of kindness inspiring others to do the same. The millionaire's heart swelled with hope. "These are the good ripples," he said, his voice filled with awe. The beggar girl nodded. "Yes. Every act of kindness, no matter how small, creates ripples of its own. And those ripples can change the world." The millionaire felt a surge of determination. "I want to create ripples like that," he said. "I want to make a difference." The girl smiled faintly. "Then you must act. But remember, time is running out." The scene around him dissolved, and he found himself back in the mansion. The clock on the wall showed that hours had passed. He had less than a day left. But for the first time, he felt a sense of purpose. He knew what he had to do. The millionaire stood in the grand hallway of his mansion, his mind racing. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second a reminder of the limited time he had left. The beggar girl's words echoed in his mind, "You must act. But remember, time is running out." He knew what he had to do. Without wasting another moment, he grabbed his coat and rushed out the door. The cold night air hit him like a slap, but he barely noticed. His heart was pounding, his thoughts focused on one thing, making a difference. The streets were quiet, the city blanketed in snow. He walked briskly, his breath visible in the frosty air. He didn't have a plan, but he knew he had to start somewhere. As he turned a corner, he saw a familiar sight. A small shelter tucked between two buildings. A sign above the door read, "Hope Haven, helping those in need." The millionaire hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open. Inside, the air was warm, filled with the smell of soup and bread. A few people sat at tables, eating quietly. A woman in an apron stood behind a counter, ladling soup into bowls. He approached her, his hands trembling. "Excuse me," he said. I want to help." The woman looked up, her eyes kind but wary. "We always need volunteers," she said. "But it's hard work. Are you sure you're up for it?" The millionaire nodded. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." The woman handed him an apron and pointed to a stack of bowls. "Start serving, then. We've got a lot of hungry people tonight." For the next few hours, the millionaire worked tirelessly. He served soup, handed out bread, and even washed dishes. It was the hardest he had worked in years, but it felt different. It felt meaningful. As he worked, he noticed the people around him, their tired faces, their grateful smiles. He saw the boy who had shared his bread, sitting at a table with his mother. He saw the man who had been evicted from his home, now laughing with a group of friends. Each person had a story, a life filled with struggles and triumphs. And for the first time, the millionaire truly saw them, not as statistics or problems to be ignored, but as human beings. When the last bowl had been washed and the last table wiped down, the woman in the apron approached him. "Thank you," she said. "You've made a real difference tonight." The millionaire smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "No," he said. "Thank you. This has changed me." As he left the shelter, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. But he knew his work wasn't done. The next morning, he woke up early and headed to his office. His employees were surprised to see him, he rarely came in before noon. But he didn't stop to explain. He called an emergency meeting, gathering everyone in the conference room. When they were all seated, he stood at the front of the room, his heart pounding. "I've made a lot of mistakes," he began, his voice steady. "I've been selfish, greedy, and blind to the struggles of others. But that changes today." He outlined a new plan, a plan to use his wealth and resources to help those in need. He announced raises for his employees, funding for local shelters, and a commitment to ethical business practices. The room was silent as he spoke, the weight of his words sinking in. When he finished, there was a moment of stunned silence, followed by applause. The millionaire felt a surge of hope. He knew it was just the beginning, but it was a start. The millionaire sat in his office, the echoes of applause from the meeting still ringing in his ears. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose. But as he looked at the clock, he realized that time was slipping away. He had less than 12 hours left. Just as he was about to dive into the next phase of his plan, the door to his office creaked open. A man stepped inside, tall, sharp-suited, and with a cold, calculating gaze. The millionaire recognized him immediately. It was his biggest rival, a man known for his ruthless business tactics. Well, the rival said, his voice dripping with mockery. "I heard you've had a change of heart. How touching." The millionaire stood up, his jaw tightening. "What do you want?" The rival smirked. "I'm here to make you an offer. Sell me your company, and I'll make sure you walk away with enough to live comfortably for the rest of your life." The millionaire's heart raced. This was his final test, a choice between his newfound purpose and the wealth he had spent his life chasing. He thought about the people he had met at the shelter, the lives he had touched, and the ripples he had started to create. He thought about the beggar girl's words, "True wealth lies in kindness and love." But before he could respond, the rival leaned in, his voice low and menacing. "Think carefully. If you refuse, I'll destroy you. Your company, your reputation, everything you've built, gone." The millionaire clenched his fists, his mind racing. He knew the rival wasn't bluffing. But he also knew what was at stake. "I'm not selling," he said, his voice steady. "This company isn't just about profit anymore. It's about people." The rival laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "People? Don't make me laugh. You've spent your entire life stepping on others to get ahead. And now you want to play the hero? Pathetic." The word stung, but the millionaire didn't back down. "I've made mistakes," he said. "But I'm